Danjong was enthroned at 12. Forced to abdicate, he was saddened by misfortune.
You know, some lives seem destined for greatness, while others just seem born into tragedy. But what happens when a life gets caught right in the crossfire of both? Well, today we're diving into the absolutely heartbreaking story of a boy king whose entire existence was just caught in the gears of history. Think about this. He took the throne at just 12 years old, the ruler of an entire nation before he was even really a teenager. And then, in just 3 short years, all of that power was violently ripped away from him.
And by the time he was 17, his short, tragic life was over.
It's an incredible story of ambition, betrayal, and a kind of loyalty that's almost hard to believe. And it really makes you ask, how on earth did a life with so much promise end so tragically? All right, let's go all the way back to the beginning. So our story kicks off in 1441, and what should have been this incredibly happy occasion for the royal family, well, it was immediately shrouded in sadness. The boy, born Lee Hongwi, was the grandson of the legendary King Sejong. But the celebration of his birth just shattered when his mother, Queen Hayeongduk, died from complications only 3 days later. As a motherless prince, he was immediately doted on by his grandparents, who really saw a bright future in him. You could imagine, growing up in a palace has got to be a pretty lonely experience, right? I mean, his father, the crown prince, was totally consumed by state affairs, so young Hongwi was basically raised by court staff. He had no friends his age, and his only real companions were books and music. They say he was especially fond of the flute, and you can almost hear that lonely, wistful sound echoing through those empty palace halls. So as he gets older, the path to the throne is looking pretty clear. But what he doesn't know is that the very pillars holding up his world and his claim to rule were about to just completely crumble, leaving him dangerously exposed. In 1448, he's officially named the heir. But then, boom, tragedy strikes, one thing right after another. In 1450, his grandfather, the great King Sejong, passes away. Then his father becomes King Munjong, but his own time on the throne was tragically short. Already in poor health, Munjong died just 2 years later. So in just a few years, this young boy lost his 2 greatest protectors. Now, on his deathbed, King Munjong knew his son was in a tough spot, so he did something absolutely crucial. He called in his most trusted scholars and officials, and with his dying breath, he begged them to protect the boy and the nation. And this plea, it would become a sacred vow. A vow that, as we'll see, would later be sealed in blood. So there he is, 12 years old, and he becomes King Danjong. And as history shows us time and time again, a kid on the throne creates a power vacuum. And guess what? His ambitious uncle was right there, more than willing to fill it. And right here, the central conflict just snaps into focus. On one side, you have Danjong. He's the rightful king, but he's just a boy, representing tradition and legitimacy, and he's protected by scholars. And then, on the other side, you've got his uncle, Prince Suyong, a charismatic, absolutely ruthless man with a warrior spirit and the entire military behind him. It's a classic showdown, really. Inherited right versus raw ambition. And that ambition explodes on the night of October 10th, 1453. In a swift, brutal coup, Suyong and his men assassinate his main political rival, the fearsome general Kim Jong-so. He then marches right into the palace, stands before his terrified 12-year-old nephew, and has the audacity to claim he just stopped a rebellion. By morning, Suyong had seized total control of the government. The boy king was now nothing more than a puppet. Okay, so Suyong has all the power now, but not everyone forgot that promise made to the dying King Munjong. A group of loyal officials started to plot, risking literally everything on the belief that a vow was worth more than their own lives. History remembers these men as the Seiyuksin, which means the 6 martyred ministers. See, after Prince Suyong forced Danjong to give up the throne and made himself King Sejo, these men cooked up a desperate plan: assassinate the usurper and put Danjong back on the throne where he belonged. But, and this is just heartbreaking, their noble plan was doomed. One of their own, afraid for his life, betrayed the conspiracy. The plot was exposed, and the fallout was swift and absolutely merciless. These are the names of the 6 men. They were all captured and brutally tortured, but they never, ever renounced their loyalty to Danjong. Every single one of them chose death over serving a king they believed was illegitimate. They became these enduring symbols of unwavering principle.
You know, their sacrifice really forces you to stop and ask a tough question that just echoes through history. What is loyalty really worth when the price is your life and the lives of everyone you love? So that failed plot, it was the final nail in the coffin for Danjong. He wasn't even useful as a puppet king anymore. Now he was just a living threat to the new king. And this is where we get to the final and maybe the saddest chapter of his life. King Sejong stripped Danjong of all his royal titles, demoting him to just Prince Noson. Then he was exiled to a place called Cheongyangpyo, which was basically a natural prison. It was surrounded on 3 sides by a deep river and on the 4th by a sheer cliff. He was completely, utterly alone, and even worse, he was forcibly separated from his young wife, Queen Jungsoon. It's in this profound isolation that the 16-year-old boy wrote poetry to try and express his despair. He wrote, "Though my grief should end each year, the grief is endless." Wow, you can just feel the sheer weight of hopelessness in those words, can't you? This is a kid who had lost literally everything. The final blow came when another relative tried to start yet another plot to restore Danjong to power. For King Sejong, that was it, the last straw. Convinced that as long as Danjong was alive, he would be a symbol for rebellion, Sejong sent poison to his place of exile. In October 1457, at just 17 years old, Danjong's life was ended. But here's the thing, the story doesn't really end with his death. In fact, his death cemented this powerful legacy of loyalty and tragedy that would echo for centuries. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the vanquished are remembered far more powerfully than the victors. And what's just wild is how long it took for any kind of justice. After he was killed, his body was just cast aside like a traitor's. But it was secretly buried by a brave local official who risked his own life to do it. For over 2 centuries, he was officially a disgraced prince. It wasn't until 1698, a full 241 years later, that his honor was finally restored, and he was officially recognized once again as King Danjong. And this really brings us to our final thought, to the core of this whole story. Danjong and the Seyuks enforce us to consider where true loyalty really lies. Is it to the person who just happens to hold power at the moment? Or is it to the principle of justice and legitimacy that the throne is supposed to represent? It's a question that's just as relevant today as it was more than 500 years ago.